For most of my life, I believed I was doing what every good daughter was supposed to do. I carried the weight of a dad whose approval felt like oxygen. I smiled through Sunday dinners that tasted of silence more than comfort. And I told myself that loyalty could mend cracks that were spreading wider every year. On the surface, we looked like a family with everything: the right house, the right gatherings, the polished photos framed in hallways. But behind those doors, there were shadows that never left. Secrets lived in our rooms like uninvited guests. They sat with us at the kitchen table. They followed us out to the driveway when the night was too quiet. They lingered in the empty corners after the laughter ended. For a long time, I thought I could outrun them. I worked harder than anyone expected. I built something with my own hands. I tried to believe that success and distance might protect me. But blood has a way of pulling you back, even when you fight it with everything inside you. Betrayal does not always come like a thunderclap. Sometimes it comes like a smile from someone who knows too much. Sometimes like a sister's silence when you need her to speak. Sometimes like your own reflection staring back at you, asking how much more you are willing to take. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I was losing myself piece by piece, if I was turning into the very person I feared. And then there were nights when the truth cut so sharply I knew nothing could ever be the same again. What would you do if the life you trusted shattered in a single evening? How far would you go to hold on to what is yours when the very people who should stand with you are the ones pulling the ground out from under you? This is not just a story about wealth or reputation. It is about a daughter who refused to stay silent about the price of family, about the power hidden in the very moments you think will break you. I promise you, the road I walked will take you inside a house filled with lies. It will show you the cracks that split open when truth is forced into the light. And it will leave you asking yourself what you would do if everything you believed about love and loyalty turned out to be a lie. The night of the retirement banquet felt heavy even before I stepped into the ballroom. The hotel sat gleaming under the New York skyline, a 5-star monument of glass and marble that looked like it had been built for people who lived their lives in the spotlight. The doormen wore white gloves, the chandeliers sparkled through wide windows, and the lobby smelled faintly of lilies and expensive polish. I had been to countless events in my career, but walking into this one felt different. It was not about me, at least not officially. It was my dad's night. Harold Baker, 75 years old. Corporate king, the man who had spent decades building his name until it loomed larger than the people around him. The ballroom buzzed with chatter. Men in dark suits, women in gowns that shimmered under the lights, waiters carrying trays of champagne and tiny hors d'oeuvres that looked too delicate to eat. Music floated from a live quartet near the stage, elegant but restrained. My heels clicked against the polished floor as I moved through the crowd, nodding at faces I recognized, offering polite smiles that felt heavier than they should. Everywhere I looked, there were people who had worked with my dad, people who owed him favors, people who whispered about him in boardrooms but showed up tonight to honor his legacy. I found my table near the front, reserved with a placard that bore my name in gold lettering. Next to it sat my mother, Linda, her hair perfectly styled, her pearl necklace glinting softly in the light. She gave me a small smile, the kind that tried to reassure but never quite reached her eyes. On her other side was Emily, my younger sister, glowing in a silver dress that caught the light each time she shifted. She leaned in close to my dad, laughing at something he said, the picture of a dutiful daughter. My seat felt colder than the rest, as though even the chair knew what was coming. The program began with speeches from colleagues, carefully written tributes that praised Harold's vision, his leadership, and his contributions. Laughter rippled when someone told a joke about his strictness. Applause swelled when a former partner called him the backbone of the company. I clapped when everyone else did, though each sound from my palms felt like an echo rather than a cheer. I watched my dad soak in admiration, his chest puffed, his smile fixed like a crown he had been waiting to wear. Then came the moment that shifted the air. My dad rose from his seat, microphone in hand, and his voice cut through the room. He thanked the guests, accepted the praise with the gravity of a man who believed he deserved every word. Then, without warning, he called my name. "Rooney, come up here." His tone carried command, not invitation. A hush fell as eyes turned toward me. I felt the weight of 150 stares pressing against my back as I stood smoothing my dress with hands that trembled only slightly. My heels clicked again as I walked toward the stage, each step sounding louder than the music had moments before. I climbed the few steps and stood beside him, my smile tight, my heart steadying itself for whatever he intended. He looked at me with eyes that burned more than they shone. For a split second, I thought he might embrace me, say something about family, about legacy, but instead his hand swung hard across my cheek. The sound cracked through the ballroom louder than the applause had been, sharper than the notes of the violins. Gasps broke from the crowd. Someone's glass slipped and shattered. Phones lifted instinctively into the air. My face stung, my ears rang, but I did not flinch again. He spat words that sliced deeper than the slap. He called me ungrateful, accused me of betrayal, demanded the keys to my Malibu villa, a property worth $25 million that I had bought with my own success. His voice rose with each word until it filled every corner of the room. The ballroom erupted into murmurs, a restless tide of whispers and shifting chairs. I saw guests glance at one another, unsure whether to look away or keep their cameras up. Some mouths hung open in disbelief, others curled into smirks that betrayed their hunger for scandal. The violins faltered, one string squeaking, as though the music itself recoiled. I stood frozen, not from shock, but from choice. My cheek burned, my heart thudded, but my voice stayed silent. I let the weight of the moment hang, let the crowd see what I had known all my life. My dad's hand was not just flesh and bone striking skin. It was years of disdain, years of dismissal, years of control made visible in one brutal gesture. I turned without a word, stepped down from the stage, and walked across the floor as the whispers swelled. My hands did not shake as I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and dialed the one number I had memorized for this night. The line rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered. I spoke only a few words, low enough that no one else could hear, but clear enough that the choice had been made. By the time I slipped out of the ballroom and into the cooler air of the hallway, the sound of the slap was already spreading beyond the walls. Screens lit up, videos uploaded. The story of Harold Baker and his ungrateful daughter beginning to crawl across networks faster than anyone inside could imagine. The hallway outside the ballroom was lined with tall mirrors and gold sconces that threw light across the carpet in warm pools. I caught a glimpse of myself as I passed. My cheek still flushed from the slap, my lipstick slightly smudged, my eyes wide and fierce. For a moment, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. She was not the obedient daughter who had once shrunk under her dad's shadow. She was someone else now, someone who had seen the truth laid bare in front of hundreds of witnesses. I kept walking until the muffled sounds of the ballroom softened behind the heavy doors. The hotel corridor stretched long and quiet, my heels echoing as if to remind me I was still standing. My phone remained in my hand, warm against my palm. The line already closed after that brief exchange. The person I had called would know what to do. That was all that mattered. I leaned against the wall for a moment, steadying my breath. Memories flashed quickly and unbidden. Birthday dinners where my dad gave Emily a gift and handed me a lecture. College acceptance night when I had waved my MIT letter in front of him only to hear him mutter that it was wasted on a girl. The first pitch meeting for my company when he told me no man would ever take me seriously. Every word, every gesture, every withheld nod of approval had led to this night. The slap was not a surprise. It was simply the proof carved into my skin. I closed my eyes and let the anger settle into something colder, steadier. Inside the ballroom, I knew the whispers were turning into stories, the phones into headlines. It would not be long before the footage spread beyond the walls, carried into living rooms, offices, and board meetings across the city. My dad thought he had humiliated me, but what he had really done was unveil himself. The sound of footsteps drew near. I opened my eyes to see a young waiter pause at the end of the corridor, his tray empty now, his eyes darting nervously as if he had witnessed more than he wished to. He hesitated, then gave me a small nod of sympathy before turning quickly and vanishing into the service stairwell. Even strangers could see what had happened. That knowledge pressed on my chest, but did not break me. I straightened my shoulders and walked toward the elevators. My reflection followed me in the mirrored walls, steadier now, calmer. I pressed the button and waited, the quiet hum of the hotel filling the silence. When the doors slid open, I stepped inside, the polished brass walls closing around me. For a moment, it felt like standing inside a vault, sealed off from the noise and judgment above. The elevator descended slowly, each floor number glowing in succession. I thought about the guests, still sitting at their tables, the champagne half drunk, the music abandoned. I thought about Emily standing near him, about my mother's eyes wide with helplessness, about the way he had looked at me as though I was nothing. The memory tightened inside me like a fist, but I let it stay. Pain could be fuel if you knew how to hold it. When the doors opened to the lobby, the cool rush of air met me again. The marble floor gleamed under the chandeliers, the lilies still fragrant, as though the world had not shifted upstairs. I crossed the space quickly, nodding briefly to the doorman who held the door without question. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual life. Cabs streaked past, voices called on corners, neon signs flickered. None of them knew what had just broken open above. I stood at the edge of the sidewalk, phone still in hand, and let the night air cool my cheek. My pulse slowed, my thoughts sharpened. I knew this was only the beginning. A slap in a ballroom was not the story. It was the spark. What would come next would burn hotter, brighter, and there would be no hiding from it. I raised my phone again, scrolling briefly until I reached another name. My thumb hovered, then pressed. The call rang once before the voice I trusted most answered. I did not need to explain everything. Only a few words were enough. Yes, it has started. When I ended the call, I looked back at the towering hotel behind me, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. Somewhere inside, my dad still believed he could command the story, bend the guests, silence the truth. But the truth was already moving faster than him, faster than me, faster than any of us. I turned away, stepped off the curb, and walked into the night. The air in the ballroom felt heavy after the silence that followed the arrival of Eleanor. Conversations that had once been light and casual now turned into nervous whispers. My dad tried to regain his footing, forcing laughter that sounded brittle, trying to brush off what had just happened. Yet the shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. I stayed near the doorway, my hand still tingling from holding the phone earlier, my cheeks still warm from his slap. My dad raised his glass again, his voice booming. He began retelling his story, weaving himself into the center of every success that our family had ever known. He spoke of how he had built everything from nothing, how his sacrifices had carried not just our household but the community. His voice rose and fell like a preacher's sermon demanding agreement. He turned his words toward me, accusing me of biting the very hand that had fed me. I could see the way guests shifted in their seats, some nodding politely, others staring down at their drinks. The weight of his control pressed down on them as much as it pressed down on me. He thrived on that power, the subtle intimidation that made people afraid to contradict him. Then Emily stepped forward. My younger sister moved with a practiced grace, the kind of confidence she wore whenever she stood beside him. Her voice rang clear, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. She told everyone that I had changed, that I had forgotten the family, that I had turned cold and selfish. She said that I thought my success gave me the right to stand above the people who had raised me. Her words pierced deeper than the slap, had not because they were true, but because I could see in her eyes that she believed them. I remembered the girl who had once shared a bedroom with me, who used to whisper secrets under the blankets when our parents fought, downstairs. I remembered holding her hand when she cried, promising her I would always protect her. But somewhere along the way, that bond had twisted into rivalry, fed by my dad's constant comparisons, his endless declarations that one of us was worthy and the other was not. She had chosen to stand with him, and I could not blame her entirely. He knew how to make loyalty feel like survival. My mother sat quietly, her eyes flickering between me and Emily. She looked as though she wanted to speak, but years of silence had carved too deep a habit. Her hands trembled in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line. The conflict inside her was almost unbearable to watch, yet I knew she would not rise against him. She had never dared before. As my dad's voice thundered on, I caught a fragment of his words that made my breath still. He spoke to Emily in a low tone, though loud enough for those nearest to hear. He said that all the paperwork was ready, that the legal steps to claim my house were already in motion, that tonight was only the beginning. My blood ran cold, but outwardly I kept my composure. So it was not just a drunken outburst. He had been planning this. He wanted not only to humiliate me, but to strip away everything I had built, to prove to everyone that he still controlled my fate. The guests leaned in closer, their curiosity sharpened. They could sense something hidden beneath his words, though none dared to ask. Emily nodded along, her smile smug, her arms slipping around his as if they were allies in some private war. I stood still, letting the moment unfold, refusing to give him the reaction he craved. My silence seemed to unsettle him, though he covered it with more laughter, more grand stories about his sacrifices. He painted me as a spoiled daughter who could not appreciate her dad's greatness. He told them I had abandoned the values he had taught me, that I was blinded by money and pride. Inside me, anger twisted with sorrow. I wanted to shout that my achievements were my own, that I had fought for every inch of ground I stood on. I wanted to remind them that he had never believed in me, never supported me, never lifted a hand to help when I struggled. But I knew the truth would not matter to him now. His goal was not honesty. It was domination. I caught sight of a few guests whispering among themselves, their eyes flicking toward me with doubt. Some of them had known me for years, had watched me work, and had congratulated me when my company succeeded. Yet in the face of his commanding voice, even their memories seemed fragile. That was his gift, his curse. He could bend reality with words, make people question what they knew. Emily's voice rang again, clear and certain. She said that I had stopped being part of the family, that I had abandoned our traditions, that I had chosen wealth over love. Her words drew nods from a few of my dad's closest friends, men who had always viewed me with suspicion because I had dared to step into a world they thought belonged only to men. I felt the sting of isolation. The ballroom was filled with people, yet I had never felt more alone. Even the chandelier light seemed harsher, pressing down on me like judgment. Then I saw the flicker of cameras again, guests raising their phones, recording not just my dad's rage but my sister's accusations. That gave me a strange kind of strength. Let them record. Let the world see what family betrayal looked like when wrapped in silk, dresses, and polished shoes. I breathed slowly, letting my heart steady. His words no longer pierced as deeply. They revealed more about him than about me. The fact that he needed to shout so loudly told the truth. He was afraid of losing control, afraid of what I had built without him, afraid that his legacy might fade in my shadow. And though my mother stayed silent, I caught her gaze for a moment. In her eyes was something small but fierce. It was not approval, not support, but it was recognition. She knew, she saw. Even if she could not speak, she understood that tonight was different. I held her gaze for just a second longer before turning back to him, my posture tall, my silence unbroken. The night in the ballroom dragged on, each word my dad spoke pressing into me like a stone. Yet even as his voice filled the air, I felt myself slipping backward into a tide of memory, pulled under by the weight of years that had shaped everything leading up to this moment. My cheek still burned from his slap, but the fire inside me came from deeper wounds, ones carved long before tonight. I was 10 the first time I realized that being his daughter meant living in the shadows. I remember standing in our kitchen, clutching a cardboard solar system I had made for school. The planets dangled on strings painted in colors I had mixed myself, each one carefully measured. I held it up to him, eager to show him what I had done. He barely glanced at it, then snorted. Girls should learn to cook, not waste time with silly science projects. His words cut sharper than any slap. My mother had tried to soften the blow, saying how creative it was, but her voice had been timid, drowned out by his dismissal. When I was 16, I came home from school with a thick envelope in my backpack. I had been accepted into MIT, my dream, a place I had worked toward for years. I laid the letter on the dining table in front of him. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw pride in his eyes, but it twisted into disbelief. He laughed, shaking his head, saying they must have lowered their standards, that it was probably a mistake. My heart sank, yet I refused to let him take away my excitement. I packed my bags that fell and left anyway. At 21, when I walked across the stage at graduation, I searched the crowd for his face. My mother waved with tears in her eyes, but his seat was empty. He had claimed he was too busy, but I knew the truth. He did not believe it mattered. I carried those moments like scars, invisible but deep. They hardened me. When I founded my company in 2015, pouring every ounce of myself into the startup, his voice haunted me. He called it a childish gamble and said no one would take me seriously. Yet I kept going. The sleepless nights, the endless pitches, the sting of rejection after rejection. I lived on cheap takeout and caffeine. I rented a tiny apartment in Cambridge, and I worked until my hands shook from exhaustion. I told myself that if I made it, I would prove him wrong, even if he never admitted it. The years blurred together. Investors finally began to notice. Clients signed on. In 2021, when the company went public, I stood in Times Square watching the ticker flash our name across the screen. Cameras snapped, journalists shouted questions, and strangers congratulated me. I smiled, but inside I thought only of him. Would he even care? Would he finally see me as more than a disappointment? Bought the house in Malibu soon after, a white stone mansion perched above the ocean. It was more than a home. It was a symbol proof that I had built something lasting. I walked barefoot across the wide decks, listened to the waves crash below, and told myself I had earned this. Every wall carried my triumph. Yet even then, I felt his shadow looming. He had come to visit once. He stood in the entryway, his eyes scanning the vaulted ceilings, the expensive art, the endless glass windows that opened to the sea. He did not congratulate me. He said it was too much house for a girl. He said it belonged to the family, not to me. I laughed, then thinking he could not be serious. Tonight showed me how wrong I was. Back in the ballroom, as he spoke of his sacrifices, I heard echoes of all those years. His voice was the same. It had never changed. He believed his bloodline gave him ownership of everything I had achieved, that his title as dad meant my success belonged to him. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of roses and champagne, listening to the muffled clatter of silverware as guests shifted uncomfortably. Memory pressed harder. I was 23, sitting across from him in his office. I had come home for the holidays, proud to tell him about a big contract my company had landed. He leaned back in his leather chair, eyes narrowing. "You think you are better than your family now?" His words had been quiet, but they carried the same weight as the slap years later. The memories came faster, stacking over each other until the present blurred. Every time he cut me down, every time he told me I was not enough, every time he ignored my victories. Each one became fuel now. I opened my eyes and watched him perform for the crowd, his voice booming, his glass raised high. He had painted me as ungrateful, but I knew the truth. I had been grateful my whole life, grateful for every ounce of doubt he had poured into me. Without it, I might not have pushed so hard. Without it, I might not have found the strength to leave, to fight, to build. His rejection had been my fire. Still, it hurt. It always had. There were nights in my 20s when I sat alone in my apartment, staring at my laptop screen, wondering if he had been right, wondering if I would fail, if I would end up crawling back to him. There were mornings I cried in the shower, afraid I would never measure up. I carried that pain like armor, and now it gleamed under the harsh ballroom lights. Emily's laughter reached me again, the same laugh she used to wield like a weapon when we were children. She had learned from him. She had watched how he crushed me and decided to survive by siding with his power. I could not hate her for it, not entirely. She had lived under the same roof and endured the same rules, but tonight she had chosen her place beside him, and that choice cut deeper than anything he had said. I thought of us as little girls, hiding under the covers when they fought downstairs, whispering stories to comfort each other. I thought of the nights I told her I would protect her no matter what. And now she stood on the stage smirking as if my humiliation was her victory. I lifted my chin, forcing myself to stay steady. My silence was not a weakness, it was a promise. Every memory, every wound, every betrayal would fuel what came next. The ballroom shimmered around me, golden and fragile, like a stage set to collapse. My dad's voice roared on, but beneath it I heard something else. The echo of my own resolve, the memory of the little girl who refused to stop dreaming, even when no one believed in her. I tightened my grip on the phone in my hand. The call I had made was the turning point. The past could weigh me down, or it could carry me forward. I chose forward. I sat down in the corner of the ballroom, my back pressed against the cool paneled wall, the phone resting heavy in my lap. My dad's voice still carried across the room, but I tuned it out, letting his words fade into meaningless noise. My thoughts had shifted elsewhere toward something concrete, something sharper than his bluster. There was a clue I had carried in my mind for weeks, a seed of suspicion that had finally begun to sprout. It had started with a conversation months earlier, one I almost brushed aside. Mark Johnson, the former union leader at my dad's company, had approached me quietly after a charity event. His hair was thinner than I remembered, his face lined by years of labor and conflict. He leaned close, his voice low, telling me that the pension fund had cracks. He said money had gone missing, years back, numbers that never added up. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating, still bitter over old disputes with my dad. But the way he spoke stayed with me, the urgency in his eyes, the desperation of a man who had watched lives ruined while executives thrived. Now, with my dad's threats ringing in my ears, Mark's words came alive. If my dad had indeed been planning to strip me of my home, it would not be his first betrayal. He had already betrayed hundreds of men and women who trusted him with their retirements. I pulled the phone from my lap and scrolled through my messages. There was one name I trusted more than any other, a woman who had been my shield in battles far more complicated than family dinners. Eleanor Grant. She was a financial attorney, sharp as glass and unshakable under pressure. She had guided me through my company's IPO, had saved me from countless legal pitfalls, and she had become something like a second mother, though she would never admit it. I tapped her number. The line clicked and her voice came through low and steady. She asked if I was safe. I told her what had happened, though I did not need to go into detail. She already knew the type of man my dad was. I mentioned Mark Johnson's warning, the pension fund, the numbers that did not add up. She grew quiet, then said she had files. She had been looking into it for some time, though she had not wanted to tell me until she was sure. The relief and dread that flooded me came in equal measure. Relief because I was not crazy, not paranoid, not blinded by bitterness. Dread because if she had proof, it meant my dad's sins stretched far deeper than I had imagined. She asked if I wanted her to come to the hotel tonight. My answer was immediate. Yes, bring everything. I hung up and looked down the length of the ballroom. My dad was laughing again, his arm thrown around Emily as if she were his crown jewel. He looked invincible in the eyes of the guests, towering in his arrogance. But in 40 minutes, Eleanor would walk through those doors, and his fortress would begin to crack. My mind slipped back to the years when his company had been my entire world. I remembered being a child, watching the construction sites from the back seat of his car. He loved to show off the buildings he claimed to have built with his bare hands, though I knew even then that the workers did the heavy lifting while he collected the praise. He called himself a builder, but what he really built was control. He built fear in his employees, dependence in his partners, silence in his family. When I was old enough to understand money, I asked him once about the men who worked for him, the ones who spent their lives in hard hats and steel-toed boots. He scoffed, saying they were lucky to have jobs. He told me they should be grateful that without him they would starve. His contempt for them was the same contempt he had for me. He believed we all owed him something simply because he held the reins. Now I saw the pattern clearly. Of course he would steal from their pensions. Of course he would view their savings as his own. And of course when I succeeded without him, he would see that success as his property too. I shifted in my seat, the pain in my cheek reminding me of his hand. That sting had faded into something else, a steady pulse of anger that kept me upright. I thought of the Malibu house, the wide decks overlooking the Pacific, the way the salt air filled the halls every morning. I had built that life with no help from him, and now he dared to demand it as if it had been waiting for him all along. The minutes dragged on. My dad's voice filled the room. The guests laughed politely. Emily played her role, perfectly supporting every word he spoke. My mother sat still, her hands folded, her silence deafening. The sight of her broke my heart more than his words. I knew she wanted to defend me. I knew she loved me. But years of living under him had left her too afraid. I looked back down at my phone. Eleanor's name sat on the screen, her promise echoing in my head. She was coming. She had the documents. Soon the truth would no longer be hidden in whispers. I closed my eyes and let myself drift for a moment, imagining what that truth might look like. I pictured Eleanor walking into the room, her heels clicking against the marble, her presence commanding silence. I pictured her laying out the files showing the evidence, stripping away his mask in front of everyone. My chest tightened with both fear and anticipation, because I knew that once the truth came out there would be no going back. I found him alone in the private lounge just off the ballroom, a dimly lit space with leather chairs and a stocked bar that smelled of cigar, smoke and old liquor. He was pouring himself another drink when I stepped in, his hand steady, his back straight as if the scene outside had not cracked the world open. He did not look surprised to see me. He never was. In his mind, everything unfolded according to his plan. He turned glass in hand, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. I had seen that look my whole life, the expression of a man who believed he owned everyone around him. He raised the glass in mock salute, then took a slow sip. I stood near the doorway, my heart beating steady, forcing myself to meet his gaze without flinching. "You think silence makes you strong," he said, his voice low and sharp. "You think walking away makes you powerful. You are nothing without me, and you always will be." The sting of his slap was still alive on my cheek, a physical reminder of the humiliation he had delivered in front of everyone. Yet his words cut deeper, reaching back into every wound he had carved into me since childhood. I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms, and forced myself not to react. I told him I had built my life without him, that everything I had accomplished was mine alone. He laughed, the sound booming in the small room, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "You think your company stands on its own. You think your house belongs to you. You think you have power. But you are a girl playing in a man's world, and I can take it all with a signature." His arrogance lit a fire in me, but I held my ground. I told him people were not blind, that the world was changing, that truth had a way of surfacing. His smile widened, cruel and certain. "The truth is whatever I say it is. Those men out there owe me their lives, and those women believe what I tell them. You will not win against me." The door creaked, and Emily stepped in her heels, tapping lightly on the floor. She looked at him first, then at me, her lips curled in that same smirk that had haunted me since childhood. She moved closer to him, her hand brushing his arm like an unspoken alliance. "Dad is right," she said softly, her eyes never leaving mine. "You have forgotten where you came from. You act like you are above us, but you are not. You are just a selfish woman who thinks money can buy respect." Her words pierced me more sharply than his, because beneath her disdain, I could still see the girl I once loved, the sister I had promised to protect. I asked her why she was doing this, why she would stand against me. Her smile faltered for just a moment, but then she lifted her chin. "He has always been there for me," she said. "He understands me. You never did." I wanted to tell her the truth, that he had been using her, manipulating her, feeding her just enough affection to keep her loyal. But I could see the wall she had built around herself, the belief that standing with him meant safety. My heart broke for her, but I knew she had made her choice. My dad set his glass down with a sharp clink and leaned forward. You think you are clever, calling your lawyer, thinking you have evidence. He tapped his temple with a thick finger. I am always 10 steps ahead. The papers are ready. By tomorrow, the house will be mine. And when it is, you will have nothing. The certainty in his voice chilled me, but I refused to show fear. I reminded him that law was not as easy to bend as he believed. That evidence had a way of cutting through even the strongest lies. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time I saw a flicker of unease. It lasted only a second before he covered it with a laugh, but I saw it. Emily folded her arms, glaring at me with triumph. She thought I had lost already. She thought he would win as he always had. My silence seemed to fuel her, yet inside me a calm settled. I knew what was coming. I knew who was on their way. I stepped closer, the carpet soft beneath my feet, the room heavy with the smell of whiskey. I told him I would not be silenced anymore. I told him I would not hand over my life simply because he demanded it. My voice was quiet but steady. He laughed again, but this time it sounded brittle. You think you have some kind of power, he sneered, but you are standing alone. No one here will stand with you. I slipped my hand into my purse and touched the envelope inside, the one I had carried for months. It was a power of attorney, granting me control over assets he had no idea I had secured. It was a reminder that I was not as powerless as he believed. I did not show it yet, but just knowing it was there gave me strength. The silence stretched. His eyes bored into mine. Emily's smirk lingered, the weight of years pressing down. And yet, for the first time in my life, I felt taller than both of them. The doors to the ballroom swung open with a heavy sound that silenced every whisper. All eyes turned as Eleanor Grant entered, her heels clicking in a rhythm that cut through the air. She carried a slim leather case in one hand, her shoulders straight, her presence commanding in a way that made the chandeliers seem dim. I felt my breath catch as relief washed through me. She had come. The guests shifted in their seats, sensing the shift. My dad's voice, which had been booming only moments before, faltered mid-sentence. His glass froze halfway to his lips, his face paling as recognition struck. Eleanor had been his adversary once in the past, and he knew what her presence meant now. I followed her into the room, my steps steady, my cheeks still marked by the slap he had given me earlier. The hush in the room deepened until you could hear the faint hum of the air, conditioning the rustle of silk gowns, the nervous cough of a man in the back. Eleanor walked straight to the center of the room, her leather case snapping open with a crisp sound. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, her voice clear and unshaken, there are matters that need to be addressed before this evening can continue. She laid out the first set of documents on the nearest table, the papers stark against the polished wood. I watched as the crowd leaned forward, curiosity brightening their eyes. My dad tried to recover, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. This is nonsense, he barked, waving his hand. This is a family celebration, not a courtroom. Sit down, Eleanor, you are not welcome here. But Eleanor was unmoved. She pulled another set of papers from her case, her fingers steady, her eyes locking on him with the cool precision of a surgeon. These documents confirm the legal ownership of the Malibu property, she said. The house belongs solely to Ms. Rooney Baker. Any suggestion otherwise is fraudulent. A murmur swept through the room. My dad's smile froze, then twisted. He looked at the guests, trying to laugh it off. She is my daughter, he said. That house was bought with family resources. It is only natural that it belongs to me. Eleanor's voice cut him down. No, the funds for that purchase came entirely from Ms. Baker's personal accounts accumulated from her own earnings and investments. We have verified bank transfers, contracts, and sworn testimony. The room erupted in whispers, gasps, the clatter of silverware as guests exchanged shocked glances. I saw phones rise again, recording every word. My dad's face turned crimson, his hands clenching at his sides. He shouted, then his voice rough, trying to seize back control. This is a setup. Lies. She is manipulating all of you. He turned toward Emily, desperate for support. Tell them how ungrateful she has been. Emily stepped forward, her chin lifted, her voice sharp. Dad is right. Rooney never cared about this family. She only cared about her money, her house, her success. You do not know how cold she can be. You do not know what it is like to live in her shadow. Her words cut me, but not as deeply as before, because I could see something in her eyes now, something brittle. It was not a conviction. It was fear. Fear of what the truth might expose. Eleanor turned her gaze toward Emily, her voice firm. Perhaps you should tell them about the financial support you received from your dad in recent years. Perhaps you should explain the transfers. The color drained from Emily's face. She faltered, her lips parting, her eyes darting toward my dad. He stepped closer to her, his hand gripping her shoulder. But the damage was done. The crowd was buzzing now, whispers sharp and urgent. I stood in the doorway, my silence still intact, watching the cracks spread. Every word Eleanor spoke was a hammer strike against the fortress he had built. Every whisper from the crowd was another stone crumbling. My dad tried to roar above it all, but his voice no longer carried the same weight. Eleanor placed another document on the table, this one bearing the seal of a court, evidence of pension fund discrepancies. The first glimpse into the larger storm to come. The ballroom was no longer his. It belonged to the truth. Emily's voice cracked as the words spilled out, breaking through the brittle mask she had worn all night. The sharpness was gone, replaced by a tremor that carried across the hushed ballroom. "I never wanted this," she said, her hands shaking, her eyes glassy. "I only wanted him to see me, to love me the way he never loved you." The silence that followed pressed heavy against my chest. For the first time, Emily's voice was not filled with contempt but with raw pain. I felt the weight of her confession, the years of her trying to earn his affection by standing against me. It was a betrayal, yes, but also a plea. My dad's face twisted with rage. He gripped her arm so tightly she winced. His voice rose furious, spitting words that cracked like whips. "Do not you dare betray me. You are mine. You owe me everything." His hold on her was not paternal, it was possession. The same possession he had tried to assert over me and over everyone he touched. The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers turning sharp. What had been a spectacle now felt like something darker, something rotten at the core. My mother's face was pale, her lips trembling, her hands clutching her purse as if it were an anchor keeping her upright. Then another voice rose from the back of the room, steady and strong. Cutting through the tension, it was Mark Johnson. He stepped forward, his frame still broad despite the years, his eyes blazing with a righteous fire I had not seen in a long time. "Enough," he said. "It is time they hear the truth." Gasps rippled as people recognized him. Some whispered his name. He had been a union leader once, a thorn in my dad's side, a man who fought for the workers until he had been driven out. My dad's face turned crimson, his grip on Emily loosening. "Sit down, Mark," he snapped, his voice strained. "You have no place here." But Mark did not sit. He strode forward, each step deliberate, his voice rising. "I watched you steal from the people who trusted you. I watched men break their backs on your projects, believing they would have a pension to rely on, only to find the coffers empty. You took from them, Harold. You took from me." The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of whispers. Faces turned, eyes widened, and I felt the ground shift again. Another layer of his facade peeling away. My dad tried to laugh to brush it off, but his voice shook. "Lies," he said. "Old lies from a bitter man. Do not listen to him." Mark slammed his hand against the table where Eleanor's papers lay. The sound, sharp and final. "These are not lies, they are records. Dates. Transactions. I stood by while men begged for their futures back. While families fell apart because of you. You took it all, Harold, and now it is time the world sees it." The room fell into stunned silence, the only sound the soft shuffle of feet as guests leaned forward to hear every word. Emily covered her face with her hands, sobbing, now her shoulders shaking. My mother's tears finally spilled over, silent but unstoppable. I felt my breath catch my chest, tightening with both sorrow and vindication. All those years of doubt, of gaslighting, of being told I was ungrateful, unworthy. And now, piece by piece, the truth was being spoken aloud by others. "Not just me," my dad roared, his voice raw. "You will regret this. Every one of you." His hands trembled as he pointed at Mark, at me, at Eleanor. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. Then from the back, more voices rose. Men in worn suits, women with tired eyes. Workers, former employees, faces I half remembered from years past. They stood and spoke one after another, their words pouring into the space like a flood. They told stories of missing pensions, broken promises, stolen futures. They told stories of my dad's betrayal. The weight of it filled the air until even the chandeliers seemed to bow. My dad staggered back, his mouth opening and closing with no words to stop the tide. His empire was unraveling before his eyes, not in boardrooms or courts, but in the very place he had chosen to celebrate himself. I watched, silent, still, my heart pounding with a mix of triumph and sorrow. This was not how I had imagined justice. It was louder, messier, more painful. Yet it was real. It was undeniable. Emily dropped to a chair, her sobs racking her body. her earlier arrogance gone. My mother reached for her hand, their fingers trembling together. For the first time in years, they looked like mother and daughter again, bound by something more than silence. And I stood tall, my eyes never leaving my dad's face, watching as the fortress he had built around himself crumbled in front of 150 witnesses. Eleanor's voice carried across the ballroom with the weight of a judge, delivering a sentence. She placed another stack of papers on the table, the crisp sound of paper slicing the silence. These, she said, are certified by the Securities and Exchange Commission. They show deliberate mismanagement, concealed withdrawals, and falsified records. Every dollar taken from the pension funds is accounted for here, diverted into shell accounts that led back to Harold Baker. The crowd shifted, gasps and whispers rising like waves. People leaned in, their eyes darting from the documents to my dad, waiting for him to deny it, to conjure up the commanding voice that had always silenced opposition. But his words faltered. His mouth opened, then closed, his jaw tight, his eyes darting to Emily, to my mother, to me. Emily stood shakily, her face blotched from crying. She turned to Eleanor, her voice trembling. "Is it true? Did he really take it?" Eleanor did not soften. "The records do not lie. The money was stolen." Emily's shoulders shook as she sank back into her chair. My mother clutched her arm, her own tears streaking silently down her cheeks. My dad slammed his hand on the table, the sound cracking through the room. "Enough. You think you can humiliate me here in front of everyone I know?" He pointed a finger at Eleanor, his voice ragged. "You are nothing but a hired mouth. And you," he turned toward me, his face contorted, "you are a disgrace, a traitor to your own blood." His rage filled the air, but the crowd no longer bent beneath it. Instead, they stared wide-eyed as the truth pressed harder. Eleanor's voice did not waver. "The Malibu property is not yours. The company you claim as your legacy was propped up by your daughter's investment. Without her, it would have collapsed years ago under the weight of your theft." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the quartet, which had been lingering uncertainly with their instruments, had stopped completely, their bows resting against their laps. The chandeliers above seemed to shiver with the tension. Then Emily stood again, her hands clutching the edge of the table, her voice cracking as she cried out, "I cannot keep this secret anymore." She turned toward the guests, toward the cameras that were still raised. "I took money from him too. He gave me cash every month, thousands of dollars to keep me quiet. He told me not to ask where it came from, but I knew. I knew it was wrong." The words landed like stones. The crowd gasped. Phones lifted higher, some guests covering their mouths. My dad's face turned a deep, dangerous red. "You stupid girl," he hissed. His hand shot out as if to grab her again, but my mother moved between them, her small frame trembling but unyielding. "Stop it, Harold," she said, her voice breaking but firm. "Enough." Emily collapsed back into her chair, sobbing openly. I watched her, torn between anger and pity. She had chosen to betray me, but now she was trapped, caught in the same web that had ensnared us all. Eleanor continued, her voice now like iron. "The evidence will be filed formally in the morning. But tonight, let everyone here understand, the truth cannot be silenced any longer." My dad's fists clenched, his body shaking, his authority evaporating with every breath. He shouted again, but his words no longer carried. The guests were not listening to him anymore. Their eyes were on Eleanor, on me, on Emily's broken confession. Then another twist cracked through the night. Emily lifted her face, her voice raw. "I am pregnant." The words dropped heavy, a revelation that froze the air. Gasps rippled through the room again, whispers rising like a storm. My dad seized on it instantly, his voice desperate, clawing for control. "You see," he said, his arm sweeping toward her. "I was protecting the family. I was securing everything for the future for my grandchild." But no one believed him. The words sounded hollow, a grasping excuse. The workers who had stood up earlier shook their heads. The guests muttered their disbelief plain. He had used his own daughter as a shield, and the ugliness of it lay bare in the open. I looked at Emily, her hands folded protectively over her stomach, her tears glistening in the bright light. For a moment I saw not my rival, not the sister who had smirked at my humiliation, but a young woman trapped in the same cycle of his control, desperate for love she would never receive from him. The crowd pressed closer, the weight of judgment filling the room. My dad staggered, his shoulders slumping as the enormity of the exposure sank in. For the first time in my life, I saw him small. The ballroom felt heavier than air, thick with judgment that could no longer be contained. Every chandelier above us seemed to tremble in the silence that followed my sister's confession. My dad stood like a man cornered, his shoulders hunched, his once commanding voice reduced to a rasp that no one believed anymore. I could see sweat gathering at his hairline and sliding down his temple. A man who had been untouchable for decades, now exposed under the brightest lights of his own celebration. Mark Johnson rose slowly from the back row, his frame broad, his movements deliberate. His presence carried a kind of gravity, the kind forged from years of labor and quiet endurance. People turned to look as he stepped forward, the shuffle of his worn shoes loud against the carpeted floor. He held no papers, no polished arguments, only the strength of a memory that had been waiting too long to be spoken. Aloud, I felt my pulse quicken. I had met Mark once before when I was a teenager visiting the construction sites my dad paraded me through like trophies. Even then, Mark's voice had carried an edge of defiance that my dad despised. I remembered the way Harold dismissed him with a wave, as if brushing off a fly. Tonight, that voice returned, steady, unapologetic. "I worked under you for 30 years, Harold," Mark said, his voice low but firm enough to reach every corner of the room. "I carried beams across frozen scaffolds, poured concrete in summer heat, stood shoulder to shoulder with men who gave their bodies to your company. We believed in the promises you made, promises of fair wages, retirement security, dignity after decades of service." His words were simple, but they landed with the weight of truth. Heads nodded around the room. A few older men shifted in their seats, their faces lined with recognition. "But you," Mark continued, "you stole from us. You gutted the pension funds while shaking our hands and smiling at our children. You let men retire into poverty while you polished your shoes and told the world about your empire." My dad bristled. His hand shot up as if to command silence, but the crowd did not obey this time. His face flushed a deeper red, his lips trembling. He shouted that it was lies, all of it, but his voice cracked, the words thin compared to the solidity of Mark's presence. I watched Harold's chest heave. For the first time in my life, I saw him afraid not of losing money or power, but of losing the image that had shielded him for so long. Mark's voice grew stronger. "Do you remember Jimmy Alvarez? Do you remember the day he begged for the pension check that never came? When his wife was in the hospital dying of cancer? You told him the paperwork was delayed, and then you drove off in your new car." A murmur rippled across the guests. Some gasped, others shook their heads. A woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin, whispering that she remembered the Alvarez family. Mark looked around, his eyes sweeping the room. He was not a polished speaker, but his truth did not need polish. It burned on its own. "You talk about family, Harold. You boast about legacy. But legacy is not what you leave in marble and glass. Legacy is the broken backs of men you discarded. Legacy is widows holding bills they cannot pay because you lined your pockets with their future." I felt my throat tighten. This was not just about me anymore, not about my humiliation or my house in Malibu. It was about the community my dad had betrayed for decades. My dad shouted again, his voice desperate. He pointed at Mark, calling him a bitter old man, a failure who never understood business. But the insults fell flat. No one flinched. No one turned away from Mark. More voices rose. An older man near the front stood leaning heavily on a cane. "I worked 40 years, he said, his voice shaking but clear. "My pension disappeared. I thought it was my fault. I thought maybe I signed the wrong papers. But it was you." Another man followed, his face worn, his hands trembling. "You told us we were family. You let us rot." Their words layered upon each other, the weight of testimony piling higher, each voice breaking a silence that had protected my dad for too long. My dad tried to shout them down, tried to regain control with the booming authority he had wielded for decades, but every word was drowned by the rising tide of anger. He slammed his fist on the table, but the sound no longer commanded respect. It only made him look small, a desperate man clutching at power that had already slipped away. Then Pastor James rose from his seat. His black suit looked worn at the elbows, his hands calloused from years of community service, but his presence radiated calm strength. He walked slowly to the front, his steps unhurried, as though time itself had bent to let him arrive at this exact moment. When he spoke, his voice filled the room with a resonance that made even the chandeliers seem still. "Harold, I have known you for 40 years. I married you and Linda baptized your children, blessed your company when it first opened its doors. I stood by as you grew wealth beyond measure. And I also stood by as Linda suffered silently under the shadow of your pride." My mother lowered her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. But she did not stop him. Pastor James continued, "You have betrayed not only your workers, not only your children, but the very vows you made before God and community. You placed greed above love, power above responsibility. And now before this gathering, your sins are laid bare." The room was utterly silent except for his voice. Even the air seemed to lean closer. "You will find no honor here tonight," Pastor James said, his voice steady as stone. "Not from this community, not from this family, not from the God you have mocked with your arrogance." My dad staggered back his chair, scraping against the floor. His hands shook as though he were trying to push the words away, but they clung to him like a verdict etched in the air. The crowd erupted not with applause but with a chorus of voices. Some shouted their anger, others murmured prayers, still others simply stared with eyes that no longer saw a titan, but a thief, stripped of his illusions. I stood in the middle of it all, my heart pounding, my breath shallow. For the first time, I was not the daughter being shamed or silenced. I was a witness to justice long delayed but finally taking form. My dad's lips moved, but no words came. His face twisted in disbelief, as if he could not fathom a world where his authority no longer mattered. He clutched the edge of the table, his knuckles white, but it gave him no anchor. Emily sobbed quietly beside my mother, her hand resting on her stomach. She no longer looked at my dad. Her gaze was fixed on the floor as if ashamed of ever having trusted him. I inhaled deeply, the weight of years pressing against my ribs. I thought of every night I lay awake as a child, hearing my dad's voice thunder through the house, watching my mother shrink under his rage. I thought of the way he dismissed my dreams, told me I was less because I was born a girl. Tonight, those wounds did not vanish, but they began to close. The chorus of voices grew louder, the truth no longer containable. I knew this was not the end, not yet, but the unraveling had begun, and it could not be stopped. The ballroom emptied slowly, like a tide pulling back from the shore. People left in clusters whispering to one another, their faces pale from what they had just witnessed. Some still clutched their phones, replaying the moment when my dad's mask cracked in front of everyone he had ever wanted to impress. Others moved quickly, as if eager to step out of the suffocating tension and into the clean night air. The chandeliers above still glowed, but their light felt colder now, stark and unforgiving. I stood near the edge of the room, my body heavy with exhaustion. My heels pinched at my feet, and my throat was raw from the tension of holding back tears and anger. I watched my dad sitting alone at the head table. His chair was pushed back, his tie pulled loose, his once immaculate hair damp with sweat. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, a man carved down to nothing by the weight of truth. For years I had imagined what it would feel like to see him fall, to witness the moment when his power collapsed. I thought it would feel like victory, like triumph blazing in my chest. Instead, it felt like sorrow wrapped in relief, as if a shadow had finally lifted, but left behind a deep ache where light had never reached before. My mother stood beside me, her hand brushing against mine. Her touch was soft, tentative, like the way she used to comfort me when I was a child. I turned to her and saw tears drying on her cheeks, her eyes red but steady. "We should go," she whispered. "There is nothing more for us here." I nodded, but my eyes lingered on my dad. He slumped in his chair, staring at the empty glasses on the table, as though searching for a reflection of the man he used to be. No one approached him. No friends, no allies, no colleagues. Even the waiters avoided his gaze. As we walked toward the exit, Emily followed behind us. Her steps were slow, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked pale, her eyes swollen from crying. For a long moment I wanted to keep walking, to leave her behind with the wreckage she had helped create. But then I felt her hand reach out, clutching the sleeve of my dress. "Rooney," she said, her voice breaking. "I am sorry." I stopped. The sound of her apology was raw, stripped of the smugness she had carried earlier. She looked at me not as a rival, but as a sister, trembling, vulnerable. Her hand shifted to her stomach, a silent reminder of the life growing inside her. I took a deep breath. Anger surged through me, anger at the betrayal, the lies, the way she had sided with our dad. But beneath that anger was pity, and beneath the pity was something harder to name. She was trapped just as I had been tangled in his control, desperate for approval that would never come. "I am not the one you need to apologize to," I said quietly, "but your child deserves better. Do not let him grow up in this cycle." Emily's face crumpled and she nodded, tears streaming down again. My mother slipped her arm around Emily's shoulders, guiding her gently toward the doors. For the first time in years, I saw them as they could have been, mother and daughter leaning on each other, not as pawns in my dad's game. We stepped out into the night air. The city hummed with its usual noise horns in the distance, the hum of traffic, the faint siren echoing blocks away. But for me, the world felt suspended, every sound sharp, every breath heavy. Reporters had gathered outside, their cameras flashing as we emerged. Microphones, extended voices shouted questions. They wanted statements, reactions, headlines. My mother shielded Emily, guiding her toward the waiting car. I paused for a moment, the lights blinding, the questions blurring into a wall of noise. Then I turned away, refusing to give them more than they had already taken. Inside the car, the silence was thick. Emily leaned against the window, her hand still on her stomach. My mother sat rigid, staring straight ahead. I closed my eyes, letting the hum of the engine carry me away from the chaos we had left behind. When we reached the house in Malibu 2 days later, the ocean greeted us with its steady rhythm. The waves crashed against the rocks, eternal and indifferent to human drama. I stood on the balcony, the salt air brushing my skin, and let the sound wash through me. This house had been my refuge, my proof that I could build something of my own. My dad had tried to strip it from me, to claim it as his, but tonight it stood firmly mine. Inside, the rooms felt different. The marble floors, the glass walls, the polished wood were no longer symbols of wealth to flaunt, but reminders of battles fought and won. I walked through the halls slowly, remembering the nights I worked until dawn to keep my company alive, the meetings where men twice my age dismissed me until I proved them wrong, the endless effort it took to carve out a space in a world that told me I did not belong. My mother joined me in the living room. She looked smaller in this house, almost swallowed by its size, but her presence filled the space with warmth. She touched a photo frame on the shelf, a picture of me at my IPO celebration. My smile wide, my eyes bright. "I am proud of you," she said softly. "I always have been." Her words pierced me in a way my dad's never could. I felt tears well in my eyes, not from pain, but from the release of years of silence. We sat together, the two of us, and for once there was no fear of his voice booming through the door, no shadow stretching across the room. Emily joined us later, hesitant, her eyes downcast. She carried a cup of tea in trembling hands. My mother made space for her, and together we sat, 3 women who had survived the storm of one man's control. As the night deepened, I found myself reflecting on what had happened. My dad had always believed he was untouchable. He thought power could silence truth, that wealth could erase sin. But tonight proved otherwise. Karma had a way of circling back, slow but unstoppable. His empire crumbled not because of outside enemies, but because of the very people he had dismissed. I knew the legal battles ahead would be long. Eleanor would file, the evidence hearings would be scheduled, headlines would continue. My dad might fight until his last breath. But in the court of public judgment, the verdict had already been delivered. His name was stained beyond repair. I turned to Emily, watching the way she touched her stomach as if guarding it from the world. A part of me wanted to hold on to anger, to remind her of the pain she had caused me. But another part saw her as she was now broken, frightened, and determined not to pass her wounds to her child. "Your son deserves to grow up free," I told her. "Free from secrets, free from lies, free from the shadow of men who use power as chains." She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks, and whispered that she would try. As dawn crept in through the windows, painting the walls in soft gold, I felt a sense of closure I had never thought possible. My dad remained behind in his own ruins, his voice no longer the law in our lives. My mother's strength emerged quiet but steady. My sister began to face her truth, and I, for the first time, felt the weight of generations lifting off my shoulders. I looked out at the ocean again, the endless horizon stretching before me. The waves reminded me that life moved forward, always forward. No matter how violent the storm had been, I had learned something through all of this, something carved deep into me. Power built on fear is fragile. Love buried under pride suffocates. And the truth, no matter how long it takes, will always rise. I turned back inside, my heart steady. The future was uncertain, but it was ours to shape now, free of his grip. And to you who have listened to my story, who have followed me through every shadow and every revelation, I ask this. Have you ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or betrayed by the people who were meant to protect you? Have you carried wounds that no one acknowledged? If so, let my story remind you that justice can come, that strength can grow in silence, and that voices once ignored can rise louder than any lie. If you believe in that strength, if you have ever found yourself fighting to be heard, then share your thoughts. Like this story, subscribe for more, and leave a comment with your own journey. Together, we can make sure that silence never wins again.